All right, good Shabbos, everybody. All right, so this week's parasha is called Parashat Tazria, and there are two main topics that we get discussed in this week's parasha. Firstly, it is childbirth, right? And the difference between if you have a boy and if you have a girl. There's different amount of days that you are unclean before you can go back to the temple. And I heard a story this week about a guy that asks his friend Morris. He says, "Hey Morris, I hear your wife is pregnant. Are you hoping for a boy or are you hoping for a girl?" And Morris replies, "It doesn't matter to me as long as there's a bris milah." So yes, that's also in the week's parasha, bris milah, that if you have a boy on the 8th day, he needs to get the bris milah, the circumcision covenant. And then the rest of the parasha, it goes on well into next week's parasha, has to deal with, what should we call it? The skin affliction known as Lada'at, sometimes translated as biblical leprosy, right? It doesn't exist today. It only exists during temple times and tabernacle times. There is this spiritual affliction that comes upon you. And let's see how good students you are. What causes Lada'at? Lashon hara, which is not the name of some sort of Turkish delight in Israel. It means evil speech, having an evil tongue. And having an evil tongue, Lashon hara itself takes on many forms. And you get punished by getting Lada'at, this weird skin affliction that happened during temple times. Now, what exactly, how do you best define what Lashon hara is in English? Gossip is probably the best way. Slander, evil speech literally means evil tongue. It goes beyond just gossip. But earlier this week, I sent Rebecca into the shop with some cash and I said, "Becca, go buy us some nice cookies or something so we can chill and have a picnic with Judah." You know what she bought? These chocolate cookies called gossips. In this week's parasha, she comes with it and I thought to myself, "No, get that away from us. Not now, not this week." Right? So the Talmud actually goes through this whole discussion between the rabbis trying to figure out exactly what is the cause of Lada'at, this biblical leprosy. And of course, they say it's evil speech is the main one they come across. They use a few other examples. But even with the term evil speech, they try and define evil speech because you get many different forms of evil speech, right? So gossip is a good way of discussing it. But the rabbis point out the speech that we make when we get Lada'at has to be like selfish, arrogant speech against others. And of course, the prime example that we have of someone getting Lada'at from gossip was, of course, Miriam, Moses' sister. And was she being selfish? Was she being arrogant? Yes, because what was she doing? She was speaking up against Moses, who was the leadership of our entire nation. And speaking bad against our leadership is one of the main things that causes Lada'at as well in not biblical times, but in temple and tabernacle times. So we have to talk a little bit about this talking this week. And I think that every single synagogue and every single rabbi in the world is talking about the exact same thing that was in the news headlines this week. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I don't know how many of you heard the story about what happened with Will Smith this week at the Oscars. Of course, none of us watched the Oscars anyway in the first place. But we all saw it in our news feeds and etc. later on in the week that Will Smith, he was sitting there in the crowd and the host went and said something funny but bad about his wife, who has this condition where she's losing her hair, which, by the way, is discussed in this parasha as well when it comes to Lada'at and when you get bald spots. And what did Will Smith do? He got up, walked up, and slapped him through the face on live TV. Went back to his seat and like a maniac started shouting out, let me just censor this one, "Get the name of my wife out of your mouth. Get the name of my wife out of your mouth." And you know what? In a sense, that's very perfect for this week's parasha. We need to be careful about what we say with our tongues and the words that come out of our mouth. Everything we say has an impact on the people around us. And maybe, sometimes this world needs a good slap every now and then, I think. Okay? But there's a much more subtle way to get this message across than to walk up onto the stage and slap someone to the face. So I want to share with you two quick stories from the Talmud, from the Gemara, from our rabbis that teach us this very same lesson, that we should be cautious about what our tongues say and what comes out of our mouth. So the first story comes from Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Anyone know him? You guys know Gamliel? Gamliel was a rabbi that Paul studied under, of course, right? And Shimon was the son of Gamliel. Now, because Paul studied under Gamliel, this story makes sense because there's so many stories about Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and his Gentile servant. He had this guy working in his house called Tabi. He's the most famous Gentile in the Talmud. Tabi, they always tested him. Tabi was actually this genius of a normal servant who was a Gentile who understood the laws of the Torah, right? And maybe that's why we find Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, was the one who studied under Rabbi Gamliel. Because Gamliel, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was the first rabbi who allowed his students to actually study Gentile culture. He allowed them to study Greek and Greek philosophy so that they could debate with the Greeks coming up in the world, the up-and-comers there in Athens as well. So Paul was really perfectly suited for becoming the apostle to the Gentiles. Anyway, so the story goes about Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that he was having a big meal and he was inviting some prominent individuals. So he sent his servant Tabi down to the meat market to eat cake, and he said to him, "Go there and buy me what you consider good meat." So Tabi accepted the challenge, and there he went off with his little pick and pay bag, right, with his plastic bag. And he went to the butcher, and he looked at the butcher, looked at the food, and he saw, what did he see? A tongue. He saw this beautiful beef tongue, and he said to himself, "Oh, this is a good piece of meat. My master loves some tongue." So he bought this piece of tongue, took it back, and gave it to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and he was delighted. He said, "Tabi, you have truly chosen a beautiful piece of meat." But then he decided to test his servant Tabi. And he said, "I'm sending you back to the meat market. This time, bring me a bad piece of meat." Tabi knew what was happening here. He knew he was being tested. So he went back to the exact same butcher and bought the very next piece of tongue. And he brought that back as well. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said to Tabi, the Talmud says that he put on a show, saying, "Tabi, you fool, you brought me the exact same piece of meat." And Tabi explained, "Yes, my master, but this is what the tongue is like. Depending on how you use it, it can either be a very good piece of meat or a very bad, sour, and even poisonous piece of meat." So that's one story. It's better than slapping someone on TV. There's another story from the Gemara, from the famous Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the composer of the Mishnah and the Talmud, the one who put it together for us. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was having guests over. He decided to have his disciples over for a meal. And what did he prepare for them? Tongue once again. I don't know if this was all Rosh Hashanah meals or something, but it seems like it, right? He keeps preparing tongue for them. I can see Sean is already licking his lips. He loves to eat tongue in cheek every Rosh Hashanah. Anyway, so he prepares tongue, but he decides to tell his chef, prepare two different versions of the tongue. One must be soft and tender and juicy, but the other dish must be hard and dry and tough. And he served it to his disciples, and when they came to eat and they went to go dish up, of course, they only dished up of the soft and tender, juicy meat. They didn't even touch the hard, tough, and dry meat. And he pointed this out to his disciples at the end of the meal. He says, "Let this be a lesson to you, that when you use your tongue, you should always use it in the manner that it is soft and tender to those around you, not harsh and tough when you're talking to people around you." So those are two wonderful stories from the Gemara. We find a similar teaching as well in the New Testament, right? The brother of Yeshua, James, in James chapter 3, he talks a little bit about the tongue and the power of the tongue. And he says how our body is this massive vessel like a ship. But one small little thing steers the ship, the rudder. And for our body, the tongue is our rudder. We need to be careful that with the same tongue, we are not blurting out blessings in one side and curses on the other side with the exact same tongue. And our sages picked up on this. If I'm not mistaken, it was Rashi who points out, what do you call a leper in Hebrew? You call him a metzora. It's next week's parasha, by the way. And the word metzora is actually a play on words. I think it's Rashi. We'll find out next week when we study parasha metzora, who says that you can actually split up the word metzora into motzi, ra. What does motzi mean? Brings forth. Lechem is bread, right? Motzi is to bring forth, or to sprout forth, or to spring forth. And ra, what does ra mean? It's evil, it's bad. So that's why we call someone who's a leper a metzora, because he has motzi ra. From his tongue, he sprouted forth something evil. Now, James, before Rashi was even popular, before any of our commentators were popular, James actually writes this for us in the Gospels, because in that very same chapter where he's talking about the tongue in James chapter 3, verse 11, James says, comparison to the tongue, a spring does not bring forth, motzi, does not bring forth both sweet and bitter water from the same mouth, from the same source. So too our tongue should not be bringing forth bitter things about other people. And then every now and then, we sweet them up and we kiss up or we suck up. What's the saying? Okay. So what is this moral of these stories that I shared with you? The moral is, do not have a split tongue. It talks evil on the one side and good on the other side. Because what animal has a split tongue? The sniggery snake. And that's where everything started going south. So don't be like that. When you speak to people, they must be able to understand what you're saying. There mustn't be two different stories coming out of one tongue. Okay, so that's one little lesson for us today. But speech is important to us, not only regarding how we talk about each other and how we treat each other. Speech is so important to us that it actually defines the Torah laws themselves. Because we find that as well in the cure for tzara'at. How do you get cured for tzara'at? What's the magical cure for tzara'at? You need to go to some lady with the crazy essential oils? Is it going to be some weird slung spook or akadis spook and that stuff? What is the cure for tzara'at? Yes, so you have to repent, right? But even though you've repented and the signs of your tzara'at are gone, you are not cured from tzara'at until the Kohen pronounces you clean. Till he uses his tongue and declares that you are purified. So you can't go to the doctor, even if the doctor's surname is Cohen, and look for a medical cure for it. You have to go to Mr. Cohen, not Dr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen working in the tabernacle, and he is the one who, once everything's gone and is inspected you, he is the one who proclaims you as cured or as clean. It is a verbal cure for this disease because it is not a medical problem. It is a spiritual problem that you need to be cured from. And Yeshua reinforces the same idea to us as well. In the Gospels, we all know the famous story of the 10 lepers, the minion of lepers, right? That's bad. When they were trying to do the Hagba, their fingers fell off. They couldn't do it. The minion of lepers. And only one of them comes back to say thank you, of course. But what does Yeshua do? He heals them physically. All the signs of tzara'at are gone, but he doesn't say you're healed, go home. He says, go to the priests, show yourself to the priests, that they may declare that you are pure. Even Yeshua, even though he does the actual literal logical healing, this is an illogical disease. We can't look at things and say, oh, here it is clearly. Now I should be healed because all my dots are gone. It's not until you actually go to the priest and he purifies and cleans you that you are clean. Meaning that our Kohanim, or our leaders of Israel, they hold the power to declare us clean, regardless of what logic we may say and define for ourselves, saying, look, all my spots are gone. I can say that because I'm full of freckles. But if we have tzara'at when the time comes again, we can't just say, despite all the signs that your tzara'at is gone, you can't be clean until they have declared it. And I think there's a special connection between this and what we're talking about and what today is. Because today, of course, is a special Shabbat. It's called Shabbat HaChodesh because it is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the big one. It's the big month. It's the first of our months of this year, which means it's New Year. So Happy New Year. What did Adam say to his wife last night? Happy New Year's Eve. Right? It's New Year. Happy New Year. I hope it's a wonderful year for all of you. And on Shabbat HaChodesh, we read a special reading. We're supposed to do it for our maftir today. Exodus chapter 12, verse 1 to 20. Maybe we can call up someone. Would you like to read to us today? Okay, we'll pull you up in a minute. Exodus chapter 12, which of course is the institution of our calendar. God says to Moses and Aaron, that this be the beginning of your months. Now, is Nisan the logical new year? No. What is the logical new year? Rosh Hashanah, the first of Tishri. That was the day the world was created. So that is our new year. In fact, that's even the biblical new year, right? When it talks about, in Exodus, when it talks about Sukkot, the Torah tells us at the turn of the year, you will have Sukkot. Meaning that period, Tishri, is the new year for us. That's a logical new year. But we have a different new year as well with this remembrance of Parashat HaChodesh that we have here, what we call the Jewish New Year. When God saved us and brought redemption for us in the month of Nisan, God said, all right, I'm changing something in nature. I'm now letting you declare a new month and a new year for yourself because I brought you out of Egypt. It's the Jewish New Year is the month of Nisan. Whereas the natural New Year, the logical New Year, is of course Rosh Hashanah, because that is when our agricultural year also turns around. That is also the date of creation, etc., right? So, how do we celebrate our New Year on Pesach, on the month of Nisan, Rosh Chodesh Nisan? It's to remind us of the freedom that we are no longer slaves. We now have control over our own time. That is true freedom, right? And now we have to declare it with our mouths that there is a new month. But who declares it? This is what it says. We're going to read it in a moment. Exodus 12, verse 1. It says, Hashem spoke to who? Who does God always speak to? Moshe, and this time it says, and Aaron. God spoke to Moshe and Aaron and said to them, you are to begin your calendar with this month. It will be the first month of the year for you. Lachem, for you, for you, for you. We have a special impetus into sanctifying time. God said to the leaders of Israel, Moses and Aaron, it's your job to announce the new month. And when you announce it, it will be written in the books in heaven. Regardless of what logic tells you about when the new year is, even though logically the new year is at Rosh Hashanah, you can also have this almost like spiritual, because of the redemption from Egypt, you can have the spiritual new year as well. That goes beyond logic. Because does the moon have a yearly cycle? No. The sun has a yearly cycle. The moon's only got a monthly cycle over and over again. Logically, it makes no sense to have a year based on a lunar calendar, which is why we join the two, right? We have all these leap months every now and then, every 7 out of 11 years or something like that. So this is what Hashem is teaching us. He's saying, your leaders must announce when this new year or this month of Nisan begins, and thereby you guys sanctify time. And there's a lot of discussion about this in the Talmud, pointing out to us that, does that mean that all of us, when we logically see the new moon, should say, oh, the month has begun, I'm going to go do Rosh Chodesh? No, that would be absolute chaos. That would be balagan. That's why the Torah is specific when it says God spoke to Moses and Aaron, meaning that it is the Sanhedrin's job, not every individual, it is the Sanhedrin's job to sanctify the new month and set the calendar for us. Now, there's a reason why I bring this up specifically today, because it is that time of year again, where all of us are going to have friends and colleagues and family members who are also in the Messianic movement, and they're going to come up to us and tell us, oh, we're having our Seder on this day. Oh, you celebrated Rosh Chodesh yesterday? Well, we're doing it a few days later because we saw the moon with our own eyes. Logically, this should be the new month, right? We're all going to encounter this in the next few weeks, if not already, if not even today. And it's very relevant to us, especially because of this week's parasha Tazria, and what we learn about Lada'at. What was the cause of Lada'at? Evil speech, selfishness, arrogance, like Miriam, against our leaders. The Sanhedrin, Moses and Aaron, the guys who set these calendars. Because what is the explanation we always hear? Oh, the Jews and the rabbis made their own calendars. They're wrong. I saw the moon and I blew the shofar, so I have set the calendar, right? That is nothing other than pure Lashon Hara. By its clinical definition, that is Lashon Hara according to the Talmud. And what is the result of Lashon Hara? Lada'at, this skin disease. Can we get that today without the temple? No. Do we still get it spiritually? Yes, we still get it spiritually. Meaning that among us, there's zombies. We have spiritual lepers walking among us. Remember that movie? Right? Same thing is going on with us today. People are throwing out Lashon Hara left, right, and center. And what does the Torah tell us we must do with the leper? What happens to a leper? They get isolated outside of the congregation of Israel. They get separated from the camp of Israel. Therefore, it should be no surprise for us that when people make up their own calendars, what are they doing? The exact same thing. They're isolating themselves from the congregation of Israel. Almost like self-inflicted tzara'at. Setting yourself aside from the chosen nation, it's a problem. Shouldn't happen. And the irony is that if Mashiach was to come tomorrow and to build that third temple, all of a sudden, all of us who are unclean from tzara'at, it'll start going out of our skin. We'll be able to see who's been performing Lashon Hara these last few days. And then what has to happen? We have to go to the temple. We have to go to who to get cleansed? What did Yeshua teach us? To the Kohanim themselves, the leaders of the Jewish nation. You have to walk up and say, I kind of gossip about you. Will you please declare me clean? The very people that you spoke against are the ones who now have to declare you clean. No one else can do it. Yeshua teaches us this very thing. It's a big problem. Those very Jew rabbis with their weird calendars, those are the people that have to cleanse everyone from Lada'at when that day comes. So I very often feel like Will Smith this week, where I feel like, I hear people say stuff about calendars and dates, and I want to just get up there and slap somebody. But Yeshua taught us, you should turn the other cheek. Don't lose control, right? You must refrain from attacking people. And it's a lesson for us as well. So I hope that this encourages all of you, as we're about to hear this very thing non-stop all over again from all of our friends and colleagues and people we know, that we must rather concentrate on ourselves and control our own tongues. Let your tongue rather bring healing and cleansing. And at the same time, realize whose tongue actually has any authority behind it. Because there's a lot of tongues out there talking a lot of nonsense. But there's only one tongue that God says, this one has my authority. This is the leadership. This is who's in charge. So let's learn to only listen to those right tongues, so that we ourselves can learn from that our tongues will bring about healing and purity as well, just as theirs. So that our tongues will not lead to sickness, will not lead to disease, will not lead to gossip that brings about spiritual Lada'at and defilement, and so that our tongues will not bring about judgment on ourselves. Because Yeshua gives us a very stern warning. Matthew 12:36, listen to this. On the day of judgment, learning about Yom Kippur this afternoon, stay around and learn some stuff. On the day of judgment, people will have to give an account of every careless word they have spoken. The list is going to be read out of all the nonsense you spoke in your life. And you're going to say, stop, please stop, enough. Every single careless word we've ever spoken, we're going to be held accountable for. I see you dropping your head in shame there. Listen to this. Yeshua says, for by your own words will you be either acquitted, and by your own words will you be condemned. We talk ourselves into the grave sometimes. So we're entering the new month, we're entering a new year. My prayer for all of you is that may God guard our tongues from evil and our lips from deceitful speech. Amen. Shabbat shalom and chodesh tov.